Well, turning now to the Middle East, where the U.S. has said it is pushing for democracy. But some call it instead a clear sign of hypocrisy. France and Italy are now urging the UN to put pressure on Syria to end its violent crackdown on anti-government protesters there. Washington is also considering imposing sanctions. Sound familiar? Well, for some, this is beginning to sound too much like the lead up to Libya. Still, so far, it's more outrage than action. For more now, I'm joined by independent journalist James Corbett, who is in Osaka, Japan. Hey there, James. I want to start off with what we're seeing here in Washington. 3 senators just today, Senators John McCain, Joe Lieberman, and Lindsey Graham, issued a joint statement. They said what's happening in Syria has reached a decisive point. They said by following the path of Gaddafi and deploying military forces to crush peaceful demonstrations, al-Assad and those loyal to him have lost the legitimacy to remain in power in Syria. The senator said, we urge the president to state unequivocally, as he did in the case of Gaddafi and Hosni Mubarak, that it is time for Syrian President Bashar al-Assad to go. So I'm wondering what you think about this. I mean, do you think there's any way that Syria would be the next Libya?
I think that's very much what it appears to be. And we can see that actually from John McCain, who is on the board of the International Republican Institute. And the New York Times just calmly admitted in mid-April that the International Republican Institute is one of the organizations that has been funding these so-called spontaneous grassroots uprisings in the Arab Spring. So he obviously has a vested interest in what he's talking about there. And I think we've seen the precedent in Libya with the way that the sanctions became a no-fly zone, became bombing, but not to get rid of Gaddafi. And then that was changed when Obama and Sarkozy and Cameron penned the joint op-ed in the International Herald Tribune that, yes, they will not stop until Gaddafi is gone. Now you have people like William Hague calmly floating the idea that Gaddafi must be assassinated. So we see the exact same type of buildup that's gone on in Libya, starting now with the idea of sanctions and other types of UN-led sanctions and other such activities against Syria.
James, you mentioned that John McCain was on the board of the Republican Institute. You know, explain to those who are not familiar with sort of what goes on here in Washington with, you know, interests and lobbyists, what interest some of these senators would have other than actually believing that Syria is a real threat to its people, that the government there is a threat. Explain to people kind of this inside baseball stuff in terms of special interests.
Well, it's very important for people to keep in mind that these types of International Republican Institute and the National Democratic Institute and Freedom House and others have been funding and training activists from around the world in order to carry out just these types of uprisings that we're seeing now. And the long-term plan is to start to carry out a destabilization of regimes that are not friendly to American interests, or at least to the interests of the American political elite. So you see John McCain and James Wolfenson and Madeleine Albright on the boards of these types of institutes. And these are the same cheerleaders for every warmongering attempt of American military intervention that we've seen for the last few decades. And interestingly enough, in the Syrian case, we now get these reports that there are these snipers that are killing people in funeral processions, and it's being said that these are Assad's forces. But I would really recommend your viewers to go to the Land Destroyer report, where Tony Cartolucci, an investigative reporter, has been looking into the organizations that are funding those activists, including one called Gen Next, which had a couple of years ago, they met with some U.S. Navy SEALs in order to go through some training. And you can look at the pictures on their own website of them getting training on sniper rifle use. So you see, there's Iranian news reports that are suggesting that the sniper that we're seeing in Syria right now are in fact not Syrian forces at all, but are actually sent in from the outside.
It is certainly interesting when we go into countries that we know so little about. I mean, Syria, there are very few journalists even allowed inside this country, as opposed to Libya, but it is hard to figure out who the enemy is and sort of what they stand for. And you know, it begs the question, you know, should we have a method here in the U.S. In which, you know, we lay out some guidelines or we lay out some standards for U.S. foreign policy when it comes to, you know, this pro-democracy movement sweeping across the world, really. President Obama, remember, he said in his speech, he said, you know, we can't help everyone, but what are the defining factors in who we do and who we don't help?
Well, it's important to keep in mind that the real driving ethos of foreign policy for for America for the first 150 years of its existence was non-interventionism, and that's something that the founding fathers were quite strong about. They wanted alliances, but no entangling alliances, just economic trade with all, but no entangling alliances. And unfortunately, we now see the American empire is really spreading across the world and attempting to exert its power all over the world. And I think that's very much a profound difference in the American psyche. And that's been really instituted over the past 50 years with things like the International Republican Institute and the National Democratic Institute leading the way.
And just real briefly, James, we're almost out of time. Who wins and who loses if the U.S. and other allies do get involved in Syria?
Clearly, Syria will be the loser. That's obviously. But I think Iran is also going to be the next on the chopping block because that's a very strategic partner with Syria.
What about winners?
Winners, I guess, those in the military-industrial complex who always benefit from all military intervention.
Gosh, and it seems they get everything they want these days. Independent journalist James Corbett joining us from Japan. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kristine.